Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second panel of the evening. This discussion is called Creole-unanswerables, the positioning of Caribbean American artist Geoffrey Holder. And this presentation will be brought to us by Dr. Daniela Fifi. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge our event partners for this evening, the Knight Foundation, the Green Family Foundation, the Miami-Dade Department of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs, and Dashboard. And to begin today's conversation, I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Daniela Fifi. Dr. Daniela Fifi, EDD, an arts educator and curator that has worked in museums and galleries in the Caribbean and the United States. She is a doctoral graduate in art and art education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Pratt Institute, New York, and a Master's of Arts in Art Gallery and Museum Studies from the University of Manchester, UK. This presentation explores concepts of Creolization that characterize the aesthetic and artistic production of the Caribbean American artist Geoffrey Holder during the Civil Rights Movement. Holder defined his work as belonging in the realm of unanswerables, that is, positioning his artistic production within conversations of Creolization that are centered on transculturalism, transnationalism, and hybridization. He adopted a mixture of Caribbean folkloric, specifically Haitian and modern Euro-American aesthetics into a Caribbean-American framework that he referred to as his mythologies of art that were ahistorical and supersyncretic forms of expression. During the Civil Rights Movement, when the inclusion of artists in art institutions were thought of as on the basis of racial identities and national boundaries, Holder's fluid expressions of Creolization in these spaces was a radical act. When his work was displayed in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, it had significant meaning as it transcended cultural barriers and racial barriers. I will allow Dr. Daniela Fifi to share her insights as she's done extensive research on Mr. Holder.
Thank you so much for having me here at Prizm. I just wanted to also acknowledge everyone that has made this possible today. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity of the presentation. I'm going to share screen. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, there we go. Oh, I cannot share my screen. It's disabled. Okay.
We can see it, your screen now, Daniela.
Oh, you can?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, as I've been introduced, my name is Dr. Daniela Fifi. I was introduced to, if we can move to the next slide. I was introduced to Geoffrey Holder's work. Geoffrey and I are both from Trinidad and Tobago when I worked at the National Art Gallery in Trinidad, a museum in Trinidad. If we can move to the next slide. I'm not seeing my screen. Sorry, I think there's some tech. There we go. Please slide. Right. I was introduced to Geoffrey's work while I was a curatorial specialist working in Trinidad at the National Art Gallery there. And I was enthralled by not only the visual production that he was creating, but also by his, what he calls mythologies of art, his philosophies and entry points to the work. That were very centered around a Caribbean folkloric ideas of Caribbean folklore, and not specific to Trinidad, but regionally in the islands of Puerto Rico, Haiti, Bahamas, Barbados. He sort of had a very broad scope of what Caribbean meant, what the Caribbean means, and also what art meant to the region that was in direct contrast in some ways to what I was experiencing in the educational system. So I want to frame this talk, although it is centered on Geoffrey, into a much broader conversation that I think is really significant to the work. And as I hold my experiences within art education, looking at how it impacts institutional entry points of Caribbean art, both regionally and internationally, because there are gaps that we find in thinking about Caribbean curricula, whether that be formal or informal, in entering the work, in frameworks of the work. So this is not necessarily a conversation about art history or canons, but rather institutional frameworks and how the Caribbean and Caribbean art is represented. And my research has interrogated, I've been studying Geoffrey for over a decade now, about 10 years. And the research that I've produced, it really explores these ideas of art culture, where there's this mishmash within the Caribbean, where art and culture converge, even though within institutional norms, there are distinctions between the two. And positioning and representing Caribbean artists not being a sort of fixed notion, but rather a finite stance, but something that's moving and cyclical and really quintessential to what Caribbean artists produced, not just Geoffrey, but many other artists that he had engaged with in his work. So this is producing Caribbean content within a Caribbean framework, and something that has been seen as important, eminent, significant to educators and other cultural practitioners and agents throughout the region and broadly within the diaspora as well. So before we view his work, I wanted us to first think about what was meant by a Caribbean conceptual framework, or how am I positioning that? And I notion that within Creolization and a nuanced sort of sensitivity in entering any sort of creative production from the region as a Caribbean quote unquote me, which is this in-between space between any binaries, the nuanced gap between the two. Creolization, and one of the theorists that is seen as the sort of father of Creolization is Brathwaite. And he explores Creolization within two norms, one being acculturation, which is a kind of forced interaction or involuntary power dynamics between two cultures. For example, when enslaved Africans arrived in the Caribbean region, they came with their own distinct cultures, languages, aesthetic norms, but were then, for reasons of power dynamics, forced to interact and create their new cultures, new norms, and also a sense of cultural masking to survive colonization and slavery. So this is one that is known as acculturalization, which is the forced interaction of cultures. And the second theory by Brathwaite is interculturation within Creolization, that is really an unplanned, unstructured, osmotic, organic relationship proceeding from this yoke of forced creativity or forced interaction. And this is where I think of Holder's work, this kind of unplanned, unstructured relationship that happens, that creates these dynamic fusions, and not in necessarily a harmonious way, layered with conflict, layered with tension, layered with sort of dynamic, prismatic ignitions, but one that manifests in a very real way in all of the arts of the region, and most certainly in representations of Geoffrey Holder's work. And this is the grounding of thinking about his work in a conceptual framework for Caribbean art. So what is meant by unanswerables, Creole-unanswerables, is a terminology that Geoffrey himself has referred to numerously in his writings. He was very prolific as an artist. He was a writer, he was a painter, he was most well known for his dance choreography, theater productions. He was a costume designer, he was a musician, he was a collector, and we know him from his movies and performance work, but he was so much more. He was really a prolific artist. And he thought about, when he spoke about his artistic philosophies and practices, he referred to them as unanswerable. Why was he creating, or why did he create? And he thought of it within this freedom of improvisation. He said, and I'm quoting here from him, that artwork is unanswerable, meaning asking an artist why he does what he does or what motivates him. We cannot intellectually dissect why a caveman drew. Those questions are unknown, unanswerable, and he loves the word unanswerable. I am a painter. Don't ask me why I paint. There's something spiritual inside that makes us do what we do, want to reach out. And if we knew the answers, we wouldn't do it. So those are questions that should never be asked. Don't ask me why I'm attracted to things, why I do that in this way. It is part of karma. It is part of my aura. It is part of my whole thing. So to him, art was the essence of who he was, and the disciplines of art were mediums for him to express a concept in its highest form. So whether it be dance, to create an output of a particular thought, or visual painting or music, he dabbled in everything, because he saw this art as something that was happening from within him, rather than being a discipline that you had to master. And that made him transdisciplinary in many ways, because he created across all disciplines. And he didn't really see mastering one discipline as any sort of ambition of his work. Geoffrey came to the United States. Next slide. Oh, so to back what his ideas of art were, I looked at several theorists, one being Cuban theorist Antonio Benitez Rojo, who many of our listeners may be familiar with, who wrote a book called The Repeating Island. And in here, these ideas that Geoffrey spoke of the sort of essence of art being something that that was impulsive, that came from improvisation. Benitez Rojo also expresses in his book. And many other scholars believe that this kind of complex phenomenon of improv is a key concept of artistic process of other Caribbean artists in examining the production of other artists in the region, and is the very nature of what Creolization is, and the very nature of what Caribbeanness means, this sort of cyclical, impulsive process rather than outcome. In doing something all of a sudden without thinking about it, without giving reason to it, a reflex form of an experience that allows a decentering of any artistic or creative canon. And it gives way to a freedom of expression. And scholars have often stated that the nature and variation of expressions that are exhibited through this way of producing are linked to a sort of internalized pattern. Geoffrey often worked with Caribbean artists or artists of the African diaspora, because he described what he described as muscle memory of understanding dance, movement, or even a visual language in a way that cannot be taught, but that was innate. And this is all linked to these ideas of meeting in a cultural memory. So Geoffrey moved to the United States in 1953 at the rumblings and beginnings of the civil rights movement. In coming to the United States, in the Caribbean at that time, moving from Trinidad and Tobago, he was bringing with him his own culture, calypso music. And I'm speaking about Geoffrey from all of his art forms, even though I understand that we're speaking specifically about a visual art, but in honoring his production, we're looking at various aspects of his creative productivity. So he came to New York in 1953. And at that time, this was the civil rights movement officially began in 1954. So he was at the beginning of civil unrest, of a time of great cultural and political significance and revolution in the United States, and of a lot of significant advances in the arts in the US in the 50s, and specifically in New York, where he had moved to. Jazz was rising as an art form, modern jazz, with the birth of Miles Davis's album, Kind of Blue, and Charles Parker was performing throughout New York. This was in New York he was entering. The Guggenheim had just opened. The abstract expressionism movement with Pollock and Jasper Johns and de Kooning's was also, there was a lot happening, cultural vibrancy, but also cultural represented. This music was also on the rise in the United States in the 50s. And it was here that he had, in New York, that he had a Calypso festival, and he created 3 albums. In his Calypso festival, he featured Maya Angelou, who he also trained and helped create Calypso music, alongside artists such as Lord Kitchener, that is a famous Trinidadian Caribbean Calypsonian. He created 2 albums, the Geoffrey Holder Steel Pan album, as well as the Geoffrey Holder and his Hummingbird, which was early folklore music from Trinidad and Tobago. And he wrote his own music, and here we find indications of him bringing not only Caribbean, sort of traditional, conventional Caribbean sounds, but also where Creolization creeps into how he was producing. So, for example, the role that language plays in the region, and that Geoffrey was coming from this lineage, is an important role in the culture of Caribbean creative production. So, if we reflect on Creolization processes, and what Geoffrey held is very intriguing, he experimented with language in his music making. This that we're seeing on the screen is a handwritten song of different languages that he combined, some being Spanish, French, English, that he would combine into one word or one sentence. So if you heard it, it may not make any distinguishable sense because it's an imagined language that he was creating. But in thinking about the lineage that he was coming from in the Caribbean, where enslaved Africans were creating their own languages on the plantations as a form of cultural masking and survival. Well, this is what Geoffrey had also been utilizing in his music. So he was creating languages, imagining songs that the sound of it sounds similar to jazz. It's nuanced with these different improvisations of languages. Then in his dance, he created a series of performances, all based on Caribbean folklore, some of which were directly from Trinidadian culture, and others were created from other influences in the region, most specifically from Haiti, as you alluded to in the introduction. So here we have an example of Dougla, the Dougla dance, which is also a ballet. He also created Banda and the Prodigal Prince, all inspired by folklore. And all elements of these productions were significant in how they merged different ethnicities present in the region. So Dougla, for example, is a merger of East Indian or Southern Indian and African movements. Prodigal Prince that we see here, all elements of this performance were based on Haitian folklore. Prodigal Prince depicts the Guide spirit and Banda choreography in context of a sort of dreamlike state that represents the space where spirits live. It is meant to convey a watery space between the Americas and Africa, and the dreamlike watery space was a formulation of a unified Africa, a unified American experience, and a unified Caribbean diasporic identity across all of the Americas. And in many ways, Holder's invention of the Prodigal Prince acts as a Haitian notion of the Black Atlantic. He devised this in speaking with a visual artist, Hector Hippolyte from Haiti, who had, that Geoffrey saw one of his paintings and had explained to him in a dream that he had seen this image, and Geoffrey created this ballet, the Prodigal Prince, based on this conversation with, and this artwork from Hector Hippolyte. And the invention of Prodigal Prince and the term of the Black Atlantic that it represents is a manifestation of ethnicity and culture as a fluid state rather than something that is static, as something that is transnational, that is intercultural rather than strictly national or a tribal phenomena. And through the journeying across the ocean, hemispheric bridges, transoceanic exchanges from Europe, Africa, and the Americas and the Caribbean are forged in this visual experience. The Black Atlantic, according to Gilroy, is a traveling culture and a phenomena of Creolization. And along these lines, Holder's depiction of Haitian artist Hippolyte's dream, the Prodigal Prince, is a watery space where cultures and the arts and peoples meet. It can be linked conceptually to notions of cultural creolization as well. Okay, so at this time in the 1950s, when Geoffrey was presenting this type of work, there were clear black and white lines in the United States in coding in cultural institutions and arts institutions. So white coding for dance was considered for the concert stage, where there were divisions made between white modern dance and black modern dance, for example. And amid the setting of the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, Holder's experience of culture upon his arrival in the United States would have been very different from, not very different, but different experience from in the Caribbean. And through reading texts at that time, one theorist, Meehan, describes these constructs of race and culture in the Caribbean and the US, and he posits that the Caribbean, there existed a wide array of racial and ethnic categories that people move through in some sense of fluidity. And in entering the United States in the civil rights movement, Holder experienced a very sort of binary system of Blackness. So his cultural identity and these notions of creolizations within ethnicity was something that was radical to produce on stage in these institutions. I wanted to also touch very briefly on his collecting. He did have an exhibition and also was part of a Sotheby's auction catalog on his very vast collection of artworks from around the globe. He collected indigenous artworks primarily from Mexico, from the Caribbean, mainly Haitian artworks, from Native American works from the United States, and also very religious or symbols of Christianity from across Europe. So the Virgin Mary, crucifixes, things like that. What was intriguing about his collection is that scholars believe that Holder's collection did not really hold any kind of particular thread that ran through it or any particular framework, and sort of struggled with understanding it. And nor did it align with any sort of art historical canon. He resisted categories. It was deeply idiosyncratic and the result of something that was immensely personal, and also came from this voice that he called, that was coming from an impulse, or what I would refer to as a sort of birthing of Creole ideas of blending. Perhaps the value in his collecting and his work can be found in the destabilizing nature of it, and also in its journey away from home, and in its positioning in a lack of belonging, that I think is really beautiful and important. So in his visual art, I'm going to look at one particular piece, which is the Maria Virginia. It's an oil painting. And here we find a Black Virgin Mary. And behind her, we find a crowd of Black women with large Sunday hats on. They may be attending church or on their way to church. And here he brings up notions of religiosity, of the Black diaspora thought, and it's layered with Creolization, with religion, religious syncretism, and ideas of Creoleness. I say this because if you look very closely at, on the right corner of the figure in the image, you will see a red heart with these spikes coming out of it. If you look at her head, there is a band of white beads, and she's holding a Black Jesus. Geoffrey was pushing against the conventional forms of how of how this image would have been portrayed. He was looking for an image of a Black goddess that he created, but he also wanted to create it with a what he called dramatic tension, in a religious picture imagery, but also grounded in folklore of Haiti. So when we think about symbolisms of this Black Madonna and child, from a theoretical standpoint, the image of the heart can be found in Haiti's Veve drawings, in the Izuli Freda, who is the goddess of love. And this image is thought to have come from an African traditions within the Dahomey people or tribe. And she was a goddess that oversaw lovers. She's found in other aspects of his work in the Prodigal Prince that we saw earlier. And she is also a goddess that is tied to Haitian traditions, but belongs to really rooted in African visual, in African visual language. So this is one image that he was pulling from for reference. And the other is from a Christian, the M and the Lady of Sorrows, a symbol for Our Lady of Sorrows, or the Virgin Mary of Sorrows here, where you see a gold heart with 7 knives drawn, sort of puncturing it, that is known as the Meta Dolorosa. And this image which we find in vivid drawings, we find in Christianity. He managed to blend hair in the heart on the Virgin Mary's chest. And also the halo of beads around her head that you would find in Christian depictions of the Madonna, and the very detailed lace dress that she has around her neck. So we see this layering of cultural representation in Geoffrey's work and in this visual painting. And it represents the frenzied nature of Creolization that envelops history, it envelops location, it envelops the expressions of the Maria Virginia, and it places it within this sort of unknown space, the unanswerables that he speaks about. It is ever-changing, it is open-ended, it is unpredictable, it is playing with these ideas of unknown psyche, social, cosmic notions, but never able to be grounded or contained. And thus this space resists labeling, it resists classifications, it resists finite groupings, and it resists binaries. And it is where the interaction between creativity and conflicting doubling exists. And it is in this third space, the languages of complexity and nuance of Creolization that can be found across his artworks is most explained and easily visible. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you. This is Geoffrey and his brother in Trinidad that really influenced his work, Bosco Holder. They both painted women. They have a series of work that they painted the Black body and particularly of a woman. So he influenced Geoffrey in his music, in his visual production, and also in dance. They were both dancers.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Daniela. I'm going to open it up to the audience that's here in Miami to ask you any questions. A mic is coming around if anyone has questions of Daniela. Nobody? Anybody? Yes, we have a question. We have a question.
Hi, Daniela. Thanks for this. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Bosco Holder because I'm so much more familiar with his work as a painter.
Yes.
Yeah, and I was curious, and they're very different, yeah? So I was curious if they've ever worked collaboratively or had a project where they were in conversation through their work.
Right, yeah. Well, Geoffrey created, when he was growing up in Trinidad, Geoffrey and Bosco had a dance company. And they would create musical productions, costuming, visual art together. They saw all of the art sort of combined and interacted in conversation with each other. But yes, certainly when they grew up together, they created work. They had their own dance company that they created together. And then when Bosco left for England and Geoffrey left for New York, they still collaborated, but most of those productions were happening in the earlier years of his life.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Daniela? Yes, there's over here, Derek. There's one question over here. From Lisa.
So first I'm going to say I feel very ignorant that I didn't know about his visual art piece. I know him as an actor and as a dancer. I wanted to know, did he exhibit? How did we not know about this side of him?
That is such a great question and the impetus of my work as a researcher. So thank you so much for asking that. Geoffrey was so well known as a choreographer and a director, obviously from The Wiz, and he won a Tony Award for that in the 70s. And he was he was on television for He was in the James Bond movies as Baron Samedi, and he was known visibly in in the popular culture in that way. But his visual arts and his paintings, sculptures, he had 2 warehouses of paintings and sculptures, just thousands of artworks that he painted really initially as a means of supporting his other creative productions. And he created it for himself and commissioned work for his friends. And he had a few exhibitions in the United States and in Europe as well. But he primarily, painting was something that was private and personal to him, and not something that he really produced for the mass, for the public, but within his private circles and his own, for his own sort of creative stimulation. And so he was not known as a painter, but he was an incredible painter, absolutely incredible. And we're hoping through this research that there will be an exhibition that will be birthed from this, so that the public can see his work. So yeah. So you may not have known about his work because he did not exhibit heavily in the US, his visual arts. Hello? There we go.
Thank you, Daniela. And I'm just going to ask a follow-up question because I think that was a great question. Do you have any idea of when you plan to mount that exhibition of Geoffrey's work?
Yes, so that's in conversation now. I would hope within the next year or 2 to have an exhibition of his paintings. So that is something that, concretely I can't give dates, but hopefully within the next 2 years. Yeah, I should say that at the moment, his writings, his poetry, a lot of his the paper archives of his works or his songs, his songwriting is at Emory University. I think about two or 3 years ago, it was sold to Emory University. And his paintings are still in New Jersey and in New York. So they're part of the Holder archive that through the Mellon Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, we are working now on making that archive accessible to the public for research, for people that are interested in studying Geoffrey's work, that it will be more accessible. And that should be by next year. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Daniela. We really appreciate your insights. It was such a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot about Geoffrey that I did not know, and I'm sure everyone here can say the same. So thank you for your extensive research. Thank you for sharing it with us. And thank you for being a part of our 9th edition of Prizm.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yes.
Thank you for having me. This was a great honor.
Yeah. And just to close out, I just wanted to acknowledge again our event partners for this evening's panels. I'd like to thank the Green Family Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Miami-Dade Department of Cultural Affairs, Dashboard, and the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs. We are going to take a brief intermission, and then we'll be back with our 3rd panel for the evening.